When I was about 8 years old, I had an experience that still makes my skin crawl to this day. My parents had me late in life, so my two older siblings, Chris and Angela, were at least 10 years older than me. That night, I was woken up by the sound of a commotion downstairs. It was late, and I could hear my parents talking urgently, almost panicking about something. I got out of bed, opened my bedroom door, and called down the stairs, "Mom, Dad?" My mom came to the bottom of the stairs, her face tense. She said firmly, "Go back to bed." I could tell something was wrong, but I listened without asking any questions and returned to my room. As I lay in bed, trying to fall back asleep, I heard the front door downstairs slam shut. Then there was silence. I assumed they had left the house, though I had no idea why. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. Later, I woke up again to more noises downstairs, the sound of the front door closing and footsteps. This time, it was quieter. There was no talking, just the sounds of someone moving around the house. I heard cabinets and drawers being opened and closed, and even the fridge opened. I told myself it was probably my brother Chris. He was old enough to drive and often came home late, rummaging through the fridge for a snack before heading to bed. It all seemed logical, so I didn't think much of it. Then I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. They grew louder as they approached my room. My door creaked open slowly. I stayed still, lying on my side, watching the door with half-open eyes. The hallway was dark, and the person at my door didn't turn on any lights. All I could make out was a shadowy figure, their head silhouetted in the doorway. I called out, naming everyone in my family, "Chris, Mom, Dad," before finally asking, "Who's there?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, they simply closed the door and walked away. I heard the footsteps retreat back down the stairs. Convinced it was my dad checking on me after coming home, I was confused but not overly scared. After a while, curiosity got the better of me. I climbed out of bed and went downstairs to see what was going on. I left the lights off as I crept into the kitchen, where I froze in my tracks. Standing in the middle of the dark kitchen was a tall figure. My heart skipped a beat. "Dad?" I asked hesitantly, assuming it was him because of the person's size. In a deep, unfamiliar voice, the figure said, "Go back upstairs." I bolted up the stairs, slammed my door shut, and dove under the covers. My mind raced. Why had my dad's voice sounded so strange? I was too young and naive to realize the terrifying truth, that this wasn't my dad. Not long after, I heard the front door open again, followed by the sound of my parents' voices. I went to the top of the stairs, and they looked surprised to see me awake. I asked what had happened, and they explained that Chris had been in a car accident. He was fine, but they'd rushed to the hospital as soon as they got the call. I realized they had been gone for hours. Still piecing everything together, I asked my dad if he had come to check on me earlier. That's when I learned they hadn't been home at all. My mom's face went pale as the realization hit her. She started yelling at my dad, blaming him for forgetting to lock the front door in their hurry to leave. When I told them about the figure in my doorway and the person in the kitchen, they both sprang into action. My dad grabbed his gun and searched the house while my mom called the police. The last thing I remembered was being asked by a police officer to give my story. My parents told me they felt like morons having to tell the cops that they left me alone and that they left the door unlocked. I don't think anything of value was stolen, even though whoever broke into the house clearly had no intentions of harming me. I think a complete stranger in your house is already a terrifying rodeo. Now imagine going through that at 8 years old. When my cousin Mason and I were in our early 20s, we went on several camping trips across Wyoming. This particular trip happened when I was 22 and Mason was 23. It took place in Beartooth Forest, a spot Mason had camped in before, though it was my first time there. We planned this outing during the middle of the week, as our work schedules often gave us weekdays off. Camping midweek meant fewer crowds and less traffic, a quieter way to enjoy the wilderness. As always, I let Mason take the lead. He was an Eagle Scout, and I trusted his expertise completely. We parked at a designated picnic area and started hiking into the forest. After about 15 minutes of trekking through the trees, we found a clearing large enough to set up our campsite. It had enough space for 2 tents, a portable stove, and a fire pit, making it an ideal spot. We unpacked and set to work. Mason pitched his tent in minutes, while I struggled with mine for over 20 minutes, as usual. Once the tents were up, we built a ring of stones for our campfire and gathered wood. Mason had brought fire starters and a lighter, making it easier to get the fire going. By then, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. Mason, always the chef of our trips, started grilling steak and burgers. He took pride in the meals he prepared on these outings, and I never complained. He was a fantastic cook. As the aroma of sizzling meat filled the air, we kept our bear spray nearby, just in case the smell attracted any wildlife. Mason always reassured me that black bears were unlikely to wander into a campsite with an active fire, but he also reminded me that people were the real concern in the wilderness. After eating, we cracked open a couple of beers and played classic rock on a Bluetooth speaker. The peacefulness of the forest, combined with the music, good food, and conversation, created a vibe that's hard to describe unless you've experienced it. As the night deepened, we moved on to card games, using a small folding table Mason had brought for this purpose. We eventually switched to Uno, and it was then that we first noticed something unusual. From the darkness beyond our firelight, we heard footsteps and a distinct humming sound. I paused the music, and the sounds became clearer. Someone was out there, walking and humming in the pitch-black forest. Mason quickly told me to grab the flashlight, but by the time I found it, the sounds had faded away. Though unsettled, Mason assured me it was odd but not necessarily dangerous. We resumed our card game, though with the music turned down low. Suddenly, a large stick landed with a thud in the middle of our campsite, making both of us jump. It hadn't fallen from a tree. It had been thrown. Mason shouted into the woods, demanding that whoever was out there leave us alone. In response, we heard retreating footsteps. I suggested packing up and moving elsewhere, but Mason dismissed the idea, saying it was too dangerous to hike in the dark. Instead, we kept our bear spray within reach and decided to take turns staying awake to keep watch. Mason took the first shift, sitting by the dying fire with a book while I crawled into my tent. I fell asleep quickly but woke up sometime later, disoriented. My groggy mind registered something odd, a head silhouetted against the opening of my tent. "Is that you, Mason?" I mumbled, assuming he was waking me for my turn. The figure didn't respond, and as I blinked to clear my vision, it unzipped the tent and disappeared. Fully awake now, I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped my tent to look outside. The fire was completely out, and Mason's tent was zipped shut. I rushed over and shook him awake. It took a moment for him to grasp what I was saying, but when he did, he grabbed his bear spray and admitted he must have fallen asleep on watch. He suggested I grab my sleeping bag and join him in his tent for the night. As I did, the eerie humming started again, faint but unmistakable. Mason heard it too and urged me to hurry. Inside his tent, we lay awake, clutching our bear spray and listening to the unsettling sounds of branches snapping and footsteps in the distance. The hours crawled by until dawn finally broke. With daylight on our side, we hastily packed up and hiked back to the car. Neither of us felt like continuing the trip. That experience has haunted me ever since. 6 years later, Mason has invited me on other camping trips, but I've always declined. The thought of someone or something stalking us in the woods, combined with the image of that head peering into my tent, is something I'll never forget. Camping, for me, is forever tainted by that night.